Hi, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Arun, for the introduction, and my deepest apologies for the delay. We had a bit of a technical issue here, and I finally resolved, so I'm really happy that we're all together here. This is our inaugural panel, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this opening panel discussion. This is the fourth consecutive year that Asda'a BCW is the platinum sponsor of the summit. And I'm really happy that we are all coming together after a very difficult year to talk about what has changed, the media scene, the economic landscape, and of course, the impact on the PR sector as well. And of course, we meet in very different circumstances here in our fourth summit, where I'm sure, like me, all of you miss the joy of in-person meetings. But I'm glad we're all together to discuss the state of our industry and what is at stake during these challenging times. I'd like to take a moment to thank Paul Holmes and Arun Sudaman for putting this together and getting such great people together to discuss the subject. The theme of the summit, I think, of reset is very, very appropriate. We are looking at the PR industry that has gone through some dramatic changes during the last year. Impacting growth. And to remain resilient, we have to have an optimistic outlook. It is important for the PR industry to rethink our business and our operating models. As I observed last year, it is a time for us to tear up those time-tested communications playbooks and reinvent for the new reality that we live in. And I think all of us realize that. What matters most is that we evolve very quickly, we retool, we reskill, and also look at how relevant our work is for the changing needs of our clients, and of course, being relevant to the media as well. At Asda'a BCW, our research and our hands-on experience over the last 20 years in the region tells us that the Middle East is entering a new phase of regional growth and optimism. And our role as PR practitioners must be to set a new communication agenda. And that's why the theme of our opening panel today is a new narrative for the Middle East, a manifesto for change in public relations. In my view, there are three drivers of change, and we're going to discuss this more as the panelists are quickly introduced. The first one is that we are looking at a new era of peace resulting from the normalization of ties between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and the United States, and a number of other Abraham Accords as we know it. The second is the increased focus of regional governments and businesses in both mitigating and adapting to the effects of climate change. What does that mean to governments and businesses across this vast region? And the third discussion is how governments are now focused so much more on inward investments, on domestic investments, especially how massive investments are being put together by state-owned entities and sovereign wealth funds in the region. And I think to discuss this further, I would like to introduce our wonderful panelists, great experts that we have been able to put together. And I'd like to discuss the new manifesto that we want. First of all, Rania Rostam, the Chief Communications Officer of GE International Markets, who leads strategic communications for GE across global growth markets. Her insights on energy sector communications is very significant as we look at especially the climate change challenge. Welcome, Rania, and thank you for agreeing to be on this panel. Mazen Nahabi, my good friend, is the founder and CEO of Karma. As you know, is a global media intelligence company with over 500 staff in 18 offices worldwide, headquartered here in the Middle East. Who will share with us great insights on how digitization is transforming the PR sector. And finally, my good friend Vasuki Shastri, who is a strategic communications, ESG, and public affairs expert. I've known Vasuki for the last 3 decades. He started as a journalist in India, then moved on to Singapore, Indonesia, Hong Kong, and has been head of communications for the Singapore Central Bank, the IMF, and Standard Chartered. Vasuki's just last week published his second book, Has Asia Lost It? Is the Asian Miracle Wearing Off? I'm sure there'll be a lot of insights that we can get from the speakers. Moving on, I would like to ask our panelists to join in the discussion. My first question to all three of you is, how do you view these remarkable changes that are shaping the Middle East today, and what will be their long-term impact, not only in the region, but across the world? I think each of you have about 2 to 3 minutes to answer that question. Let's start with Rania. Over to you, Rania.
I'm going to unmute. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes,
great. Very good morning to everyone. Thank you, Sunil. It's great to be here today. Look, so I think over the past few years, we've definitely been seeing a huge momentum and shift with across the region in terms of governments taking on bold visions for change, for really transforming the national agenda, with the goal of moving away from oil dependence to a more knowledge-based society, to more diversification. And this has undoubtedly, given us the path to more privatization. You're seeing a lot more public-private partnerships and a real push on entrepreneurship, encouraging and empowering the youth in a huge way. And this has enabled the build out of our innovation ecosystem. Interestingly, last year, towards the end of last year, so in the midst of COVID, we ran an innovation barometer survey, and it showed that the Saudi and the UAE are both being seen as countries globally as innovation conducive environments. And that speaks volumes in terms of how much progress that we've made. These are 10 countries from the US into Asia, into Europe, looking at this part of the world and saying that the change that we're driving here is creating a way forward for how we're going to innovate and bring new things. I think we can't talk about change without discussing the COVID and pandemic pushing us hard to navigate with, something that we're all still grappling to understand from a country point of view, from a community point of view, and what it means to, our livelihoods. But I think a couple of things are clear. We're definitely moving faster. I think there's a big push on initiatives that are going to allow us to build a greater sense of resiliency, more flexibility, conversations in volumes now around sustainability and how we're doing things. And this is going to have a huge impact as we think about infrastructure and industry across sectors, energy, healthcare, transportation. And what this really means when we think about also the acceleration of digitization. How are we looking at increasing efficiency and productivity? How are we enabling these virtual remote environments? Can we, repair and maintain sites thousands of miles away? We're seeing it very clearly in the healthcare sector. We've been talking, of course, for a while now about the integration of AI into the healthcare sector and building out, intelligent-based systems. But this is going to, COVID has definitely and undoubtedly accelerated this even further, changing the way hospitals are managed, our access to what healthcare workers have, patient journeys. So I think the key thing is, as we look at remarkable changes from over the past few years, changes that the pandemic has brought in, the focus right now in terms of building more resilient, sustainable economies, I think we're making real progress. There's a real push, and we're undoubtedly seeing the Middle East, countries and leaders really step up to that.
Thank you, Rania. If we can go to Vasuki for his comments on the same question.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Great to be here. What I'm most excited about is the reopening of relations between the UAE and Israel. And I think that really is very symbolic of the changes, the dramatic changes that are taking place. And I would really describe them under 3 R's, redraw, reimagine, and reinvent. And I think what the opening of diplomatic relations with Israel really shows that both countries are prepared to redraw old boundaries, which are really set during colonial rule, set at a time of conflict, and boldly move forward. And if anyone has read, I would highly recommend you read Tom Friedman's article in the New York Times today, where he says that the most remarkable aspect of this reopening of relations, it is driven by people-to-people contact. The fact that you had 135,000 Israeli tourists here in the UAE over Christmas, I mean, that's remarkable. So, you can reopen ties on a political basis, but I think what's really is going to drive progress is this people-to-people contact. And I think this is an opportunity, not just the Israel connection, it's also an opportunity, I think, for the region to reinvent itself. And, Israel has always been considered outside of the Middle East, but anyone who's been to Tel Aviv can testify that Tel Aviv feels a lot like Dubai than any other European capital. And so how do you bring Israel's strengths? Israel is a tech superpower. It's got tremendous strengths. It's got a vibrant startups scene. The UAE has always been an ecosystem, has an ecosystem of innovation. How do you marry both of these together and take it global? So I'm not really talking just about UAE investments into Israel and Israel investments into UAE, but here's an opportunity, I think, for both countries to position themselves globally as hubs for innovation. And my final point is reinvent. And I think what we've seen in the UAE over the last 2 decades is remarkable investment in infrastructure. And there used to be a time when much of the infrastructure model that countries depended on, I mean, they looked at Europe, they looked at the US, and I think increasingly they're going to come to Dubai and the UAE. So how do you capitalize on those trends, not just in sustaining this level of infrastructure investment in this region, but really taking it global?
Thank you. Thank you, Vasuki. And finally to Mazen, and just to remind everyone, the question we are responding to is, what are the how do each of the panelists see remarkable changes in the Middle East, and what would be its long-term impact for the region and the world? So over to you, Mazen.
Thank you, Sunil, and to my fellow panelists. I don't mean to sound negative, but in my view, I think the region is probably in its worst state in about 100 years. If we were to look at our region as a whole, which in my mind means the Arab world, Turkey, and Iran, I see 3 different clubs. One club, the Gulf and Israel, who are doing well. Another club who are doing okay, Egypt and Turkey, real progress, but tremendous challenges. And one club which is facing disaster, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, Libya, and so on. If we were to look at a quick metric, we're thinking about 50 million out of nearly 500 million people in our region who are doing well. 450 million face tremendous challenges. The long-term impact of that, I think, is being discussed in general at the highest levels, but some of them are not being discussed. The mental health disaster, which we're going to need to deal with for the next century. An Iraqi who's lost his home and cannot go back to Baghdad. A Lebanese person who's lost his life savings. A Yemen or a Syria that needs to be rebuilt from scratch. I haven't seen the region this bad in my lifetime, and there's definitely going to be a challenge to dig out of where we are. But I don't mean to sound too negative. I want to build on the positive impact that Rania articulated. We have the highest level of literacy we've had in the modern age, the greatest amount of women's empowership, the best amount of healthcare, the longest life expectancy, and many, many good things which are happening. But I'd like to conclude by agreeing with Vasuki that it comes down to people. And I think the governments who invest in people, who empower people, give them as much freedom as possible, they're the ones who are going to be ahead. And it's no surprise that the 6 Gulf countries and Israel are the ones who have invested the most in empowering their people, and therefore are the ones who are doing the best.
I always depend on Mazen for a reality check. So, I think, thank you, Mazen. So bring us all to reality. But, I think there are so many green shoots. One of the best things, as you would agree, about the region is nearly 400 million people, but such a youthful population. But it takes time and investment to reap the dividends from the youth population. And I think that's where a lot of governments and businesses and private sector is really investing. I mean, we have the youth unemployment problem. And I know, when we launched our 12th Arab Youth Survey last year, the top finding was nearly 40% of Arabs across the 17 countries that we polled want to leave the region. They want to immigrate to other, and that's a very, very, a huge red flag for governments because they lose the youth dividend. But yes, those are problems. But when you look at how things are changing, in terms of the peace dividend that we have, that there is finally, when you look at all the conflict zones, whether it's Syria or Libya or Iraq, or in fact, even Yemen, more people are coming to the table. Those conflicts are now quietening down. And hopefully these troubled countries, as you say, will get into a rebuilding phase. So I think there are lots of, as PR people, we are focused on the optimistic side of the story. So I'd like to focus on that, not forgetting the fact that the region is not in a very good state, for sure, I think. Moving on to my second question for all the panelists. Do you think there is a need for a new narrative for the region? Something that the PR sector can focus on. A lot of the professionals that are attending this panel, are involved with governments, with private sector, and many of them are brands that have global visions, have global ambitions. And similarly, a lot of us also work for international companies or work for international, like Rania works for GE. Is there a need for the PR sector in the Middle East to adapt to these changes and create a new narrative? And here I'd like to start with Vasuki. Vasuki, could you give us your thoughts on this?
I think looking at climate change and looking at environmental social governance, I think there's a huge opportunity here for communication experts to help companies completely re-engineer their brands. And I'm going to take a cue from Mazen by injecting some negativity here. I think most companies, and this is not a critique of companies necessarily only based in this region, essentially equate charity giving with ESG. And I think there's one thing that we PR professionals should be doing is to abolish corporate social responsibility from the lexicon, because CSR essentially presupposes that the company can behave badly in its main operations, but can contribute enormous amounts for charity, for building schools, building hospitals, and in a sense, all of its sins get washed away. But I think with the climate change challenge that we are facing, really this is a time to integrate a company's social purpose with its main operations. And I think this is a profound communications challenge that you'll be grappling with on the ground in the UAE, and you can see our peers all over the world struggling. Certainly in my time at Standard Chartered Bank, this was my huge number one priority for the last 3 years that I was at the bank. A couple of lessons to draw on from that experience, and I think most major corporations recruit a lot of millennial staff. And I find that young people really are a force for change in getting, old management team on board, that a company has to behave well. It has to comply with tangible ESG standards. It really has to have a path in demonstrating that it's fully committed in combating climate change. And ultimately, what's going to make a difference, and this is where I think the PR profession has an opportunity, is companies who are able to articulate their purpose very well and who are able to back this up with the facts. There will be a brand premium, there may even be a share price premium, while many others will be left behind.
Thank you. I think ESG, and I think that's going to be a big force for change. And I think companies need to understand this and get very, very active. Thank you for bringing that point. Over to you, Rania, in terms of how you look at the need for a new narrative emerging from the Middle East for governments, for companies. I want you to take a broader outlook on that.
So So no doubt, I think that the narrative has been evolving, and I'd say it's picking up pace. We've got a richer canvas to work off, right? Bold initiatives, breakthrough technologies, new partnerships, a lot of firsts. And to Mazen and Suki's point, also the challenges. And I look at those as opportunities and also responsibility on part of our industry. And I'd say the key thing that in terms of how we can adapt and the role that we play is inclusion. Inclusion of more diverse and local voices into our narrative. And we've got a big role to play. We can help accelerate that. We can help bring it to the forefront. I think it's exciting as an industry to watch, you know, who's taking pen to paper. That's already been evolving for a good few number of years with the technology and all the opportunities for the youth to have their own for them to be the publishers. That's not new. I think what we can do differently is get more diverse and local voices, get them from the ground up, and tie these voices to our socioeconomic mandate, the challenges there and the opportunities to progress it further, so we can build this collective momentum that we're looking for. I think if last year has shown us anything is leaning in, and it's leaning in, and it's a time for openness. And we see that already. And I think that's a great opportunity for our industry.
Indeed, Rania, I think a kind of collective message, a momentum that the region can be able to generate. And I think a number of multinational companies such as yours that operate in the region can help bring that together, because we can be such a critical and important economic bloc, as well as, opportunities to shine. And there's so much in terms of entrepreneurial spirit that's coming from the young in the region. And those are the kinds of green shoots that I'd look at, that those are the forces of change. And then finally, over to you, Mazen, for your optimistic view this time. The question again is, is there a need for a Middle East narrative to emerge from the region, a new one, one that reflects our reality, but yet is optimistic?
Absolutely. And PR and comms have really made tremendous strides in my 25 years in the region. It's night and day where we were and where we've come. The quality of talent, the quality of process, planning, impact is phenomenal, and I think continuing to grow. If there's a key word in my mind that would define the future in terms of the evolution and the narrative for our industry moving forward, it would be trust. Whether you're selling coffee or cars, whether you're trying to get Shia and Sunni to get together and get along, it all comes down to trust. And I think we all need to put that at the heart of anything that we're doing in our strategy, in our impact, and in our measurement. And a lot of the problems we have in the region are because of a lack of trust. But I think everyone is starting to realize that and is working towards it. But if we can begin every pitch, every campaign with trust at its heart, I think that would be a significant development moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mazen. Just to remind our participants that you could send questions to the panelists here on any point that we raise, if you have any additional ones, and I, as the moderator, will make sure that the questions are given to the right people here. There is one question on the chat box, which is from the audience, which says that where can we get the report you mentioned related to the innovation barometer? I guess that is to do with the Arab Youth Survey. You can get our white paper report, which we published in October, on arabyouthsurvey.com. And you can get details and data related to 12 years when we started the survey, from 2008, 2020. And of course, if you want to acquire Vasuki's book, Has Asia Lost It? You just have to go to Amazon. A little plug for you, Vasuki. I hope you like that. In any case, please let the questions come in. We'd like to really make this as interactive as possible. Sorry, Rania, you were saying something?
Sorry, I was going to say And I love the youth survey, absolutely. And the one that I was referencing to is the GE Innovation Barometer, and it's on GE.com. You can find that,
Okay.
or you just punch in GE Innovation Barometer. So that's a survey that's done across 10 different countries to measure innovation and progress in those
spaces. Okay, thank you. Thank you for bringing that in. GE.com, and you'll get the Innovation Barometer for sure. More information there. Now, moving on to some specific questions to my wonderful panelists, I'd like to start with you, Mazen. You know, you play a very critical role in terms of measuring communication impact with your work in Karma for all your great clients across the region. How do you see government communication pivoting in this new era, in this new environment? Do you see changes happening there in the use of public relations services by government, both in-house and agency support? And in that, maybe a longer question is that, how do you see, is there some openness, some transparency? Is there additional investments in PR, especially from the government sector? Because you have such great experience in that sector.
It's probably one of the most exciting things I see every day, Sunil, watching these young groups of Emiratis, Saudis, Egyptians working for their government to do good, and in growing teams with bigger budgets, and most important of all, a much higher level of skill and quality and impact. The old days used to be hold a press conference and get what I say into Al Bayan or Al Khalij. Today it's about how can I make people realize that going to Mars shows an entirely different national mindset, exhilarating, and being done with local hands and local innovation and local ambition. The level of ambition has grown, and therefore the level of funding and staffing has grown in quantity and in quality. It's very exciting, and I think what we're seeing in the UAE and in other parts of the Gulf is starting to show the way for other people in the region on how to get it right. In terms of measuring, it's fantastic that we're looking at a dialogue now, which is less about AVEs and less about impressions and vanity metrics, and much more about, well, we talked about trust. I wonder if people trust me, if people believe in my character and believe in my competence, and how do I actually measure that? Yeah. And these are the kinds of conversations we're now having with the highest levels of government throughout the region, and in fact, throughout the world. Same with the corporate entities. It's no longer about your quantitative, do I have more coverage in Qatar compared to Bahrain? It's about, do people trust what I say? Who are they? And how are they engaging with me? So the whole narrative of measuring impact has shifted from basic quantitative metrics, which largely mean very little, to something far more substantial and allowing comms professionals to really drive their campaigns on the basis of data and measuring impact and success.
Do you see, Mazen, more engagement with government? I know you do a lot of listening tools for a lot of governments. Are they getting more engaged with their audiences? And is there much more transparency? Is there, I mean, I'm looking at a 5-10 year perspective, how things have changed. And I want our audience to understand how that has changed.
Absolutely. We work with governments around the world, from America, Europe, the Middle East, Asia. I cannot think of any government whose leadership is so engaged with the public as the regional leadership over here. Whether it's taking questions and answers, doing a tweet up, engaging on Instagram, and a few members of government have even been on Clubhouse engaged in direct conversation as of the past week. They are heavily engaged and becoming more engaged. And I think they're engaged because they're not afraid. You know, they're not afraid of their own people, and they're not afraid of their own policies. They're confident. They believe in what they're doing, and their people believe in them. And they're open to that kind of engagement. And yes, they want to know whether that engagement is working. So we often work with them on finding out which stakeholder group is an advocate, which stakeholder group is a little bit hesitant, why, which messages are working, which messages are not working, and being able to identify the micro detail of their engagement through metrics which make a difference.
Thank you for that perspective, Mazen. Now moving to Rania, I want you to answer a little more specifically about GE in terms of how are you responding to changes in the Middle East? You know, GE has a nearly 80-year presence in the Middle East. So you've been here for a very long time. And I want to also ask you to look at a little more focus on the decarbonization initiatives that GE is putting together as well.
So on the decarbonization, I think as a company that powers 1/3 of the world's energy, we really do have a unique lens across the entire energy system globally. And no doubt we're seeing climate change as warranting urgent action that governments and companies are looking at. And setting also very bold targets on decarbonization. So the shape of the energy production and consumption and our role in the energy transition is critical, and we're very much at the center of that for the customers and the stakeholders that we're serving. So I think a couple of things as we think about that and what it means to globally and to this region. I think one is, how are we looking at the fuel mix and how we're looking at technologies, and how are we ensuring that as we think about natural gas, renewables, the grid infrastructure all working together in more harmony to secure the delivery and the reliability of energy systems. You know, what are we doing today so we can ensure that these systems weather pressure, there is minimal disruption. You know, we've seen it time and again across many parts of this region, challenges with blackouts. So how do we think about technology and fuel mix in new ways? And the goal is really, how are we reducing emissions? So a big part of that has to be innovating around the key technologies. For example, like hydrogen, carbon capture. So we continue to, invest obviously in R&D, listen to our customers closely. What can we pilot in the different places? Looking at what happened with the aviation industry, and as that makes a comeback, how do we think about more fuel efficient engines? I mean, what's on airliners' mind now is, so how do we improve sustainability? How improve the efficiency of the performance? So I think it's definitely, there's a technology component, there is understanding the landscape, and there's working together ever so closely with partners, from utilities to power producer to airlines, policymakers, as we set a vision, for decarbonization in different sectors. Of course, on the GE front, we've got to lead by example. So last year, for example, we set our own carbon neutrality goal, hoping to meet that by 2030. So, I mean, at the end, we're addressing a lot more than climate change. We're also addressing sustainability for the communities, reliable, accessible energy. But I would also add, that it's very encouraging to see some very specific, bold actions by governments across this region towards that. We've heard it from the UAE, we've heard it from Saudi, a big push in Egypt on renewables as well. So I think that's all exciting. It's moving in a positive direction forward. There's a lot more we have to do, and we can only do it together via partnerships. Thank you, Rania.
There's a general question that has to all the panelists, but I'd like to direct this to Vasuki. This is from Valerie Tan of Emirates. She asked, does the panel think the Middle East is still unfairly represented in international media? And a very interesting corollary question, will new media, which is the youth, help with some of this balance? How is the Middle East represented by international media? Vasuki, for an international observer, I'm sure you have a point of view there.
Looking at the region from the outside, I mean, the keywords that international media consistently represent of the region is, chaotic, unstable, dysfunctional. And unfortunately, these keywords, in a way, have been so completely embedded in the psyche of the person on the street that the very mention of the word Middle East often tends to scare people. And they obviously change their minds when they come to Dubai, when they actually here on the ground, they go away with a very different perception. So I think, absolutely accelerating people-to-people contact would be a great way of changing perceptions. And the second thing is the framing. And I think this is where, to Mazen's point, I think governments, political leaders, policymakers, business leaders have an opportunity to really consider the audience to be global and to communicate the change that is happening on the ground. And to do it, and this is where I think PR firms can help, to do it on a consistent basis. Quite often when you're living in Washington, DC, and you're accessing traditional media, you're only getting very negative political news. And to be sure, as Mazen pointed out earlier, there's a lot of negativity in the region, right? So it's not that they're making it up. But on the other hand, I think if you follow non-political voices on social media, I think there's a lot of opportunity there for rebranding. And this is where I think governments should very smartly invest in, not trying to really dictate the message, but really letting young people take charge in really articulating their vision for the region. And I think that over a period of time, that will bring about change.
Thank you. And on that as well, I mean, would your experience on helping companies and in fact, multilateral institutions as well, look at creating a purpose for organization? Is that becoming an important part? Of course, it's linked with ESG, and the license to operate for many companies is now under question. Can you throw some light on that aspect? How corporate purpose or purpose in general is impacting communication imperatives and communication strategies?
Yeah, I think the origination of the social purpose debate really happened because of the global financial crisis. And I think it's accelerating now because of the pandemic. Because the fundamental questions being asked, should profits be the only motive for a private corporation? And as I mentioned before, CSR is used as a vessel for charity giving, but it's really not integrated into the main operations of the company. And I think the financial crisis triggered tremendous change and placed a question mark really, and to your question on, to your point about social license, where company management suddenly struggled, so they asked two questions: why do we exist? And who are our stakeholders? 30 years ago, the answers would have been, why do we exist? We exist to make profits and keep our shareholders happy. Who are we targeting? Primarily the shareholder community. But I think the concept of a stakeholder corporation, where you're really targeting a much broader constituency of stakeholders, really brings us to the social purpose debate. And I think many managements, many boards are now having these very honest conversations about what the social purpose is. And I think this is a great opportunity for the PR community to help companies articulate this purpose.
Besides that, on ESG, Vasuki, I mean, do you see a need for the PR industry to reskill, to retool, to be able to understand these concepts and able to advise clients on that? Or both internal and agency folks?
Well, you're absolutely right, Sunil. I think one discovery that I've made during the course of my work is when a company is looking for ESG expertise these days, they don't think about traditional PR firms, which I think is really a mistake. And I think it's a mistake because the perception is traditional PR firms do not have the domain expertise. They do not have the technical expertise in advising companies on how to position themselves in ESG. So I would say, every PR company really should be building that expertise in-house, should be recruiting the right talent to make sure that when the CEO of a company wants to build an ESG proposition, it's the PR firm that is on the table rather than a traditional consulting firm. So you don't want your lunch to be eaten away by someone else. And I think in doing it, I think there is an intrinsic link between building social purpose, building an ESG proposition, and communicating about it to the outside world. So there's a very, very logical value chain there, which I hope PR companies will be able to exploit.
Thank you. Thank you, Abba. There's a question from the audience, which is a question directed at me. What are some of the positive insights from the latest Arab Youth survey in regards to digitization post-COVID? How quickly is the MENA region adapting to digital transformation? Thank you for that question. I think there's been a trend that we've been looking at, not just because of the pandemic, but over the last nearly 12 years that we've done the survey. And I can tell you, and just to give you some numbers, when you look at social media usage for consumption of news, 2015, there was only 25% of our sample across the region that used social media in 2015. In 2020, that's gone up to 79%. Now look at that dramatic change in just about 6 years. And when you look at young Arabs are turning to smartphones to watch videos, for example, 62% use, not surprisingly, smartphone to use all of their news consumption rather than television. And of course, when you look at subscribing to video streaming services, jumped up dramatically from almost zero about 5-6 years ago to 53% now. And music streaming services, even more dramatic, 62% of Arab youth across 17 Arab nations. And this is the age group of 18 to 24, use music streaming services. I'm sure Angami is doing really well because of that. And when you look at e-commerce trends, I think in 2018, 53% used e-commerce, and in 2020 it jumped up to 80%, of course, because of the pandemic. So those are a couple of trends, but there's some very interesting and positive, which you should spend some time on, which is gender equality. Young women in the Arab world across the Gulf, Levant, and North Africa feel they have equal rights to men, nearly 67% of the sample. I think this was one of the brightest findings that we had this year, actually. And a lot of young people are also saying that that religion plays too much of a role in public life, and they want religious institutions to reform. Now, these are we call this report Voice for Change. You can get this report on our ArabYouthSurvey.com website. So thank you for asking that question. That's from Ilyas Jabe. Of course, yes. And another interesting question is public trust in private sector took a hard hit during the pandemic. It regained some traction following vaccine rollouts, but limited to some sectors, example, healthcare. What are your thoughts on companies? What can they do to regain that trust? I'd open this question to any of the three panelists we have. Anyone can take that question. Maybe Mazen, you first. Trust in private companies.
I think building on what Vasuki mentioned a moment ago, private sector companies really have a lot of work to do to establish a new foundation of trust. I think the capitalist narrative of profit first is falling apart because of the financial crisis and now because of the pandemic. People need to prove that they care for people, the welfare of your employees, making sure that they're safe, that they're not in a COVID-infested environment, being able to ensure that they have their pay protected, that they are responsible within their community, within their environment, that they're taking care of the climate. The responsibility of a private entity or a private organization to multiple internal and external stakeholders is no longer negotiable. It has to be met. And I think we're entering a time where, especially in the European Union, that's becoming law. It's no longer becoming something that you can choose to do or opt out from. But I think most private sector entities are being run by younger people. There are many more women on boards of directors, and that is going to become the culture of all private business moving into the future. There will be a few laggards here and there, but there's no going back.
Thank you, Mazen. Anything from you, Rania, on trust in private sector companies?
I totally agree with what Mazen and Vasuki said. I think it's always, as companies, as private sector companies, you have to, you have to serve. You're serving customers, you're serving stakeholders, and you are serving the public. Like in from a GE perspective, it's electricity and better healthcare and connecting people. So we have to be answerable to what we're doing and how we're doing it. And I go back and say, I think in light of how COVID is changing the way we think, and sustainability in how we're in sustainability in solutions, sustainability in technologies, and what sustainability means to building those better communities. Yes, of course, we've got to step forward as the private sector and play our part to help advance that, the socioeconomic agenda. For sure, like you can't be in a place for 80 years and not contribute to that. You contribute to that through localization, through investment, through creating jobs. So of course, I mean, so many levels, companies, private companies have a big role to play on that front. No doubt about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. In my previous discussions with you, Vasuki, and going back to the theme of our panel today, is there a need for a new narrative emerging from the Middle East? And to borrow your idea, you're the author of this, you've said that there is a need for rebranding the region. And to go back to Valerie Tan's question, is the Middle East treated unfairly by international media? I think the onus of communicating that is with us. Can you delve on that? You did talk of the need not to take the fire from your statement, but a great way to put it, should the Middle East narrative be bigger, bolder, and disruptive? Maybe you can spend some time explaining that concept to our participants.
Thanks, Sunil. I think the first point to make is really putting trust and honesty at the center of communications. And I think the big lesson that we communication professionals have learned in the last 4 years is authenticity is overrated. I'm not going to mention any names. So we've had a political leader who was authentically dishonest, superb in communications, but fundamentally misled and was dishonest in what he had to say. And I think as a communicator, the big lesson that I took away is no more flashy communications. We really have to be honest, simple in the way we communicate to the outside world. And I think in the context of COVID-19, I think there are lessons here for the region. Some governments have absolutely gotten it right in the way they've communicated to their public about the impact of COVID-19. And two things that they've done right, I think, is first to tell people that they don't have all the facts. It's very important to tell the audience that you don't possess all the facts. This is a fast-changing environment. Things are going to change. And when political leaders get it wrong, I think it's great to go out and say, sorry, we got it wrong, and we're going to try and do a better job the next time. And I think there's some building blocks here, I think, for the region to rebuild, to rebrand. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity here. And I think one vertical that has opened up is this UAE, Israel, Bahrain, Sudan vertical, which is one part of the Middle East, which is progressive, which is moving forward, which is looking at the future. And there are many elements, and I think even if you look at the region that I know very well, Asia, I mean, there's no united Asia which is dynamic, prosperous, and vibrant. There are many parts of developing Asia which have perennial chronic problems to deal with, combating poverty. They've got domestic unrest, right? So these are ongoing issues that the Middle East is going to face. But if you're able to showcase and demonstrate that you absolutely know where you're going, and the world also knows where you're coming from, and you have a clear destination in mind, I think that forms a very, very powerful communication strategy. The other thing that I would do is, and we've got to figure out how to do it, is to bring more people bring more I'm not talking about policymakers or academics or journalists, really encourage greater tourist flows into the region. Because when people come and take a look at the ground, and hopefully this will be possible after the pandemic, when people come and take a look, they do change their minds, they tell their friends, they post good stuff on Instagram and Facebook, and that will go a long way in changing public perceptions.
Thank you, Vasuki. We've run out of time, and I thank Provoke for giving us that extra 10, 15 minutes to complete our discussions. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our wonderful panelists and for Provoke for facilitating this fascinating discussion. And if there's one point that we could all take away from this invigorating session, is that the Middle East, there is a new era of hope and opportunity that's emerging on the horizon, despite the unprecedented challenges of 12 months. And it is incumbent, and what I hear from all of you, it is incumbent on the PR sector and the industry to help convey that message that is bigger, bolder, and disruptive, that challenges some of the stereotypes that have been built about the region. And as PR professionals that have been here for a long time and grown with the sector, I think it is our responsibility to make sure that we do that honestly, openly, and with a great amount of energy and passion. And I think change must begin, and I think there can't be a better time to be able to start that change. Thank you very much, Mazen and Rania and Vasuki, and thank you, Arun and Paul, for giving us this opportunity to share our thoughts with a wonderful audience that you have today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sunil. I couldn't agree more with your closing sentiment. A very compelling discussion. It has been quite a journey charting the transformation of public relations in the Middle Eastern region, and I guess you have been there every step of the way.